Donald Trump said the United States would actually be better off without CUSMA. He said he'd rather not have a new agreement.
President Donald Trump says he's not interested in renewing the Canada-U.S. trade agreement known as CUSMA. The deal shields Canadian goods from a large number of U.S. tariffs. Trump made the comments as a July 1st deadline looms for negotiators to renew, review, or signal an intention to exit the CUSMA.
I'm not looking to renew it. I made the deal. And the primary reason I made the deal is that NAFTA was the worst trade deal I've ever seen. Yeah. And I made it better, but I had the right to terminate. And, with NAFTA, we didn't have the right to terminate. I had to get these senators to approve that deal. That was a tough thing, Congressman, too.
And when those words came out, a lot of people heard something very simple. North America's trade deal might be heading toward a breakup. But here's the strange part. Because while the headlines focused on Trump's comments, something completely different was happening behind the scenes. Canada's ambassador in Washington, Mark Wiseman, says the conversations taking place with American officials have been productive, serious, respectful, and businesslike. Now, hold that thought for a second, because if America really doesn't need Canada, then why are officials on both sides still spending hours talking? Why are technical discussions continuing? Why are negotiators preparing for July? And perhaps most importantly, why does nobody inside the system appear to be acting like the relationship is actually ending? Because once you start looking at what people are doing instead of what they're saying, a very different picture starts to emerge. And that picture may tell us far more about the future of North America than any speech, headline, or social media post ever could. I'm going to explain why. But first, we need to go back to something that happened in France. Because this story became much more interesting there. At the G7 summit, reporters naturally expected tension, trade tensions, tariffs, CUSMA, and perhaps even a major confrontation between Donald Trump and Mark Carney. Instead, something unusual happened. There wasn't even an official bilateral meeting between the two leaders. And for a moment, people wondered if that itself was the story. Was Canada being sidelined? Was there some diplomatic freeze? Mark Carney brushed that aside almost immediately, because according to him, he had 7 or 8 separate conversations with Trump over a period of about 36 hours. Not one conversation, not 2, 7 or 8. And according to Carney, many of those conversations involved economic and commercial matters. Now think about that. Publicly, Trump says America might do better without CUSMA. Privately, both sides are holding detailed discussions. And that's where things start getting interesting. Because the people inside these negotiations don't seem to be behaving like countries preparing for divorce. They seem to be behaving like countries preparing for difficult negotiations. And those are two very different things. The reason this matters is because July 1st is approaching, and that date has generated plenty of anxiety. People hear review deadline and immediately imagine a cliff. But Mark Wiseman has been trying to calm those fears. His message has essentially been, take a deep breath, because even if the agreement isn't renewed immediately, the world doesn't suddenly end.
Relax. It's all going to be okay. And it's going to be okay because we have an agreement with the United States and Mexico that expires. It expires at 11:59 p.m. on June 30th. 2036. We all have to keep that in mind. It is a 16-year agreement that was signed in 2020. And unlike our last negotiation, there's no cliff, as our chief negotiator, Janice Charette, has said. We're not falling off a cliff. We're not falling off a cliff on July the 1st.
In fact, the current agreement would remain in force for years while negotiations continue. That detail often gets lost. People hear deadline, officials hear process, and those are not the same thing. Because in international trade, things rarely happen overnight. Countries negotiate, then renegotiate, then review, then argue, then extend, then argue some more. And meanwhile, commerce continues. Which brings us to another question. If officials aren't panicking, why is everyone else? Part of the answer is Donald Trump himself, Because Trump's negotiating style has always been unusual. He often starts from maximum pressure, maximum leverage, maximum uncertainty. And then negotiations begin. We've seen this pattern before: tariffs, threats, public statements, and then private conversations. That's not unique to Canada. It's happened with Europe, with China, with Mexico. And now we're seeing the same thing with CUSMA. Publicly, the rhetoric sounds dramatic. Behind closed doors, people are still sitting at tables, still exchanging proposals, still discussing details, still talking. And here's the detail that caught my attention. Mark Wiseman says those discussions have been rational and collaborative. Collaborative. That's not exactly the word you'd expect after hearing all the headlines, and that's what creates the contradiction. Because one picture says crisis, the other picture says negotiation. So which one is real? The answer may be both. Because Donald Trump is not hiding his frustrations. He's made it very clear that he isn't happy with the existing agreement, and frankly, neither side is pretending everything is perfect. Tariffs remain a problem. Steel, aluminum, automobiles, those issues are hurting sectors of the Canadian economy. And according to Wiseman, these tariffs are actually a bigger concern right now than the July review itself, which surprised me, because most headlines focus on the agreement. Meanwhile, officials appear more worried about the tariffs. Why? Because tariffs affect factories, jobs, investment, and business confidence. Right now, not 10 years from now, and that's another reason negotiations continue, because neither side benefits from simply stopping communication. Now, let's be fair.
Used to operate for 85% of our exports. Without any action, it will remain in place for the next decade. There's an opportunity to extend it. There's always been the opportunity for any of the parties to cancel it with 6 months' notice. It's no secret the president in recent years has not been the biggest fan of CUSMA.
There are legitimate American concerns. American officials argue that some trade issues have remained unresolved for years, and from Washington's perspective, this review process isn't just about preserving the agreement. It's about changing parts of it. That's important, because there is a huge difference between saying, we want to destroy the agreement, and saying, we want a different agreement. Those are not the same thing. And sometimes in politics, those distinctions matter enormously, because headlines usually reward conflict, not nuance. But here's where I think many people are missing the bigger picture: the relationship itself. Canada and the United States share nearly 9,000 kilometers of border. Their economies are deeply intertwined. Supply chains, energy, agriculture, manufacturing, defense, critical minerals, automobiles. None of these systems were built in 1 year, and they can't simply be untangled in 1 year either. That's reality, and reality tends to move slower than politics, which is why the people inside the system often sound calmer than the people watching from outside the system, because they understand something important. Complex relationships don't disappear because somebody gives an angry press conference, and perhaps that's why something else caught my attention. At a recent meeting involving Canadian business leaders and U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer, sources described the discussions as pragmatic and measured. There were conversations about energy, critical minerals, mutual interests, areas where cooperation still makes sense, which raises another question. If the relationship is supposedly collapsing, why are both sides still talking about expanding cooperation? Because countries preparing for economic war don't usually spend hours discussing ways to work together. And maybe that's the story hiding behind all the noise, not that Canada and America are breaking up, but that both sides are trying to redefine the relationship. And those are very different things, because redefining something is messy. Breaking something is easy. And maybe that's why Carney has largely avoided emotional responses. His approach seems to be patience, technical discussions, quiet diplomacy, and letting negotiators do what negotiators do: negotiate. Now, could things still go wrong? Absolutely. Nobody knows exactly what happens next. There are disagreements. There are political pressures. There are elections. There are competing priorities. And yes, there is uncertainty. But uncertainty isn't the same thing as collapse. And perhaps that's the biggest lesson here, because if you only listen to the headlines, you'd think North America was heading toward some kind of economic divorce. Yet, inside conference rooms, inside embassies, inside trade offices, people are still talking, still meeting, still negotiating, still searching for common ground. And maybe that's because despite all the rhetoric, the reality is that geography hasn't changed, interdependence hasn't changed, and the basic interests connecting Canada and the United States haven't changed either. Which brings us back to the question we started with. Donald Trump says America doesn't need Canada. But if that's true, why are officials still spending countless hours negotiating behind closed doors? Why are conversations continuing? Why do diplomats sound calm? Why do technical discussions keep expanding? And why do the people closest to the process seem so much less alarmed than everyone else? Because perhaps the real story isn't what leaders say when cameras are rolling. Perhaps the real story is what countries do when the cameras leave. And right now, behind those closed doors, Canada and the United States are still talking. And sometimes, in international politics, that's the signal that matters most.